Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I am David Pendergrass. I received a question from a listener, I think 100 years ago. Sorry, Jeff. I'm sorry, man. I didn't forget about you. Jeff asked the question, and basically, if I would do a podcast on discussing the angel of the Lord. Angel of the Lord. He says, this angel appears distinct from all other angels. Is this a Christophany? This angel in some places appears as Yahweh in a visual form, and in others as a messenger for Yahweh. Was there a dual Godhead theology in the Old Testament? That's a great question. Let me unpack that kind of slowly for you in case this is brand new information for you. Jeff is correct that there is a well-known figure in the Old Testament and not in the New Testament at all. It's called the Malach Yahweh or the Malach Elohim. And Malach means messenger. It can be used of human messengers. Anytime anybody gives a message, it can be used of priests and prophets. It can be called Malachs. But it's also used of spiritual beings called Malachs. And we would typically translate that angel. We get the word angel, angelos, from Greek, because the Greek word angelos means messenger. So angelos and Malach are synonymous. Malach, angelos, same thing. They mean messenger, and it doesn't mean divine being. It doesn't mean spiritual being. It can be used for anybody. And when you see that in the Old Testament, that particular angel, you see a malach, a messenger. But there's one particular character. There's one kind of messenger that very bizarrely and amazingly has the identification of Yahweh after it. So we call it the Malach Yahweh. And oftentimes it's translated angel of the Lord, caps lock Lord, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, because that's the covenantal name of God, Yahweh. Other times it's Malach Elohim, which literally is plural for gods, but it's another more generic name for God in the Old Testament. And Elohim was a common L. El and Elohim were a common designation for various Canaanite religious beliefs at the time period. But the Hebrews also used Elohim as a name for their God. But Yahweh was a name, according to the Old Testament, in multiple places, of God's, you might say, personal name given to them. And I think I've done another podcast, or at least a podcast, on the meaning of that name, and I won't go into that right now. But the Malach Yahweh and Malach Elohim seems to be a distinct angel. What's interesting about this angel, this messenger, is several things, and that is the chief one. I'll just say, if I can be limiting here, the chief one is this particular angel or messenger has some kind of divine prerogative and represents Yahweh. In fact, oftentimes you can just remove Malach or angel and just put Yahweh there, and it makes perfect sense. Things like in Genesis 16, 7-14, when the Malach Yahweh, the angel of the Lord, appears to Hagar. Angel speaks as God in the first person. And then Hagar even says in verse 13, Yahweh has spoken to her, and God sees me, even though it says an angel said it. In Genesis 22, the well-known passage where Abraham and Isaac and almost killed his son, it's an angel of the Lord that speaks to Abraham, but he refers to God in the first person as I, as if it's God. We have Exodus 3, where an angel of the Lord appears to Moses in the burning bush that's not being consumed. It says an angel of the Lord appears. But then in verse 4, it's God himself who's speaking in the first person. So do you see how this goes on? I go on example after example. So it says the Malach Yahweh shows up, and then he speaks as if he is God. And this goes on Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Judges, through Zechariah, and then the Malach Elohim is also throughout the Old Testament, and so forth. There have been various responses given to this Malach Yahweh or Malach Elohim throughout the church history. Christians historically, and the patristic period, the early church fathers, typically attributed this or identified this Malach Yahweh, Malach Elohim, with a pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. And I'll go there just in a minute. But that's one option. So a lot of Christians, early church fathers said this was basically the Logos, or the Word of God, the second member of the Trinity, before he became flesh. So they won't call this figure Jesus, because Jesus is the name we give to the Logos when he becomes incarnate and takes on flesh in first century Palestine. So they would never call him Jesus before he actually received the name Jesus. So they would say, well, this was the Word, or this is the second member of the Trinity, or the Son of God, pre-incarnate, that is, pre-flesh. Jews, of course, historically would never ever say such a thing, because they don't believe that Jesus is the incarnate Word of God. And so for them, that's not true. For them, typically, as far as I understand and what my research is, there's usually one or two options. A very common option that scholars give, and I think many Jews would say, is Malach Yahweh is just a reverential way of keeping distance between Yahweh and the people. That's it. It's just a way. They really do mean Yahweh, but they don't want to sound like almost like a pagan god. So to keep some transcendence or some distinction and otherness, they introduce Yahweh's appearing to people as an angel, because that's acceptable with ancient Judaism. That's acceptable. What's not acceptable is that Yahweh himself has a figure and he can be seen. And so a very common response to who is this Malach Yahweh, Malach Elohim, is that in fact it's just Yahweh, but the ancient Jews and to this day would say, yeah, but we don't say that or believe that because we're trying to keep distance. So we're being nice. We're trying to be nice. We're trying to keep him holy, that is to say, separate, distinct, and other. That's one major way of understanding. The second major way of understanding the angel of the Lord is that it is, in fact, an angel. It's an angel. It's maybe the highest form of angel there is. And this angel has the authority to speak as God in the first person. And that's certainly possible. Jews had different rankings for their angels. They didn't have a developed angelology or demonology for centuries. It's pretty standard in Old Testament scholarship to think that the Jews developed these notions when they came back from Babylonian exile. So by the time they get back, say 5th century BC, roughly 6th century BC, they start developing more of these concepts. And by the time we get to the New Testament, well, things are very different because they've been so influenced by the Persians and all numerous religions. But Zoroastrianism, which came from that part of the world, had a much more developed angelology and demonology. So it's not surprising around the period just before the New Testament was composed, so a few centuries BC, that there's much more understanding of these divine beings. But having said that, again, you read the Old Testament, they're there. It's just not very developed. But they do have different rankings, and you have archangels, you have angels who oversee other angels, and the Christians, the earliest who are Jews in the New Testament, pick up the same idea. And so you have Gabriel and you have Michael as a warrior, and Gabriel's a big dog as well. So it's not crazy to think that ancient Jews thought that this Malach Yahweh, Malach Elohim, also performed a particular function. His job was to show up and be God Yahweh's voice. So it's not that this angel of the Lord is some rogue angel roaming the world, forming covenants with people and doesn't know what he's doing, but rather God the Father. In this interpretation, God the Father is in fact keeping his distance because he doesn't have a physical form in that sense, keeping distance from the humans, but he's still speaking through them directly through a representative. So those are the options. I mean, really, in general, all the research I've done to this through the years, it really comes down to one of these three options, and maybe there are some other options. But I think that these are the three biggies. Either it's a pre-incarnate Christ, which, of course, most Jews rule out of hand immediately. Doesn't mean they're right. I'm just saying that's a idiosyncratic Christian view. Second option is that it's just a way of being kind. It's really Yahweh, but they don't want to say that. And the third is, no, it really is a high form of angel. In the New Testament, there are only a few allusions to a pre-incarnate Christ. I want to talk about that in just a second, but before I go there, just to be real clear, in the Old Testament, I get asked questions like this through the years, and these are good questions, and I'm say this next point to help try to clarify a very important distinction, it seems to me. One is when Christians ask question about whether or not Jesus was doing something, or whether or not God was doing something a certain way in the Old Testament or way back then, it's one thing to ask the question, is that person X? On this particular podcast, is that angel of the Lord a pre-incarnate Christ? That's one question. Should we identify that person? It's a very different question. And this is the important distinction part I'm making. It's a very different question to ask. Did the ancient Jews think that ancient angel of the Lord was a pre-incarnate Christ? And I make that distinction often, I'm doing right now, because I have heard a lot of bad interpretations of the biblical text, it seems to me, because they rip things out of and the early church fathers did this all the time. All the time. They would say things like, well, clearly it must mean XYZ about some Christian doctrine, therefore blank. Well, my response is, well, maybe, but that's not what an ancient Jew would have thought ever. They didn't know. Ancient Jews had, as far as we can tell, if they had this view, they never talked about it. Ancient Jews did not know of heaven or hell. They didn't know about it. They didn't know about a world to come. They just didn't. All ancient Jews, for example, that's my first, I won't give tons of examples. I'm just saying, here's an example of a very, very common question I get, or this is where this gets confusing for people. They did not think that way. Ancient Jews did not think, how do I die and go to heaven? That never occurred to them. The entire sacrificial system was not about being forgiven to go to heaven. It was not. It was not. It was not. Every Jew, as far as we can tell, all the literature, believe that everybody goes, you might say, goes to the same place when you die. Everybody goes to the same place. You don't go to heaven or hell or Disney World. You go to Sheol. Sheol is this place where dead people go. It's the place of your ancestors. It's Abraham's bosom. And it's not miserable. It's not horrible, but it's also not awesome. And the reason why, it seems to be in at least the Psalms, it's not awesome because you can't worship God there. That is, you can't go to the temple anymore. So that's why they want to be rescued from Sheol, because, and they'll say this, if God, if you don't rescue me and I go to Sheol, how am I supposed to worship you? They do believe in an afterlife of some form. Like I said, that is Sheol. They do believe their ancestors have some kind of existence. It's not that ancient Hebrews did not believe in an afterlife. They believed in it. Everyone goes to the same spot. You go with your ancestors and you're dead. They don't seem to have jobs. They seem to be conscious when they're there. Okay, so people always ask me, well, Dave, what about heaven and hell for Abraham or whatever it might be? And I go, well, it's one thing to ask the question, did these kind of concepts exist in the ancient world, or did they exist? Was there a heaven, or perhaps if God were to send people hell early, would there have hell for people in the ancient world? I mean, those kind of questions. Versus, that's one question. The other question is, did they understand that or believe it? And same thing here by the Trinity. Was this the pre-incarnate Christ? My response is, to be very clear, to get back to the point here, and that is, no ancient Jew would have thought this is the pre-incarnate Christ. As far as we can tell from the literature, I mean, if they did, they kept that completely silent. Like their concepts of heaven and hell. I think the most likely explanation is they didn't believe in it. They didn't believe in black holes. They didn't believe in viruses. They didn't believe in geometry. They didn't write about any of it, I think, because they didn't believe in it. There's no hint of it ever. And there's no hint they believed in a pre-incarnate Christ. Now, David, does that mean he didn't exist in the ancient world? That's a different question. And to that, my answer is, and I'm going to go to the New Testament here in a second, but my response in the Old Testament is I don't know. What I don't know is, I don't know if this angel of the Lord represents the pre-incarnate Christ. Was there a divine logos? Was there a divine son? I mean, the basic Christian theology is, well, sure, yeah, right, forever, eternal. But whether or not this being is representing the pre-incarnate Christ is a very different question. So we move to the New Testament. We see some examples that people often give as, these are examples that he was there all along. And my response again is, maybe he was there all along. Maybe that's the proper interpretation. I'm not against saying that the angel of the Lord really was the pre-incarnate Christ. I am against saying that ancient Jews would have had any concept of that. So when we read our Old Testament, we should not read into it something that they did not believe, or we will almost certainly misrepresent or misinterpret what was going on. And that's very important. So, for example, even if you do believe that these angel of the Lord appearances, you say, well, these are the early forms of Jesus, and therefore they should have experienced this Malach Yahweh as foretaste of Jesus. My response is, I don't find that convincing at all. Why would they say that it's foretaste of Jesus 800 years before Jesus was born? I don't get that. In fact, what it tells me is that they learn more about God, and I would say God the Father, through those experiences for sure. This angel does have some similarities with Jesus some, but Jesus, of course, is not an angel. Jesus is not a messenger. In that sense, he's not just merely an angel of the Lord. He's not. He's much more than that. So, or even early Christians, even if these Bible verses I'm about to cite for you, even if they're hinting at that, early Christians did not base the theology on Jesus being an angel. In fact, there's only one person who has a PhD in history. In fact, he's not a Christian at all. He's the one guy, his name is Carrier, his last name is Carrier. He believes that the early Christians did think Jesus was an angel, and they saw visions of an angel, that he never was an historical figure. They had visions of an angel named Jesus. But nobody believes that. Nobody in historical scholarship, nobody in the world believes that. No one agrees with him. And so all that to say, early Christians did not think Jesus was an angel. Early Christians did not say, look at all these examples in the Old Testament. He was there all along. Well, that matters to me. They don't cite any of those verses to say, see, that really was Jesus all along, or the pre-incarnate Christ. It's not till you get, like I said, it's not until you get to the early church fathers that they start reading back into the text those things. So here's some examples of the text that I can find in the New Testament. This first passage I'm going to mention, I talked about in a podcast on inerrancy as a 4-part series, and I spoke about this, I think, in episode 1 or 2. Is the Bible inerrant? But I'm not going to, and I did that pretty in depth. Here I'm going to very briefly about this and give you my conclusion. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and 10, Paul's talking to the Corinthians about learning from Israel's failures, not to be like them and avoid sin and so forth. He says in chapter 10, verse 1, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea." Of course, there he's talking about through the Exodus account. "And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food." Now that's, of course, Paul's interpretation. They're not eating spiritual food in Exodus. They're actually actual food. But Paul's making the point, it seems to me, that he adds the word food of the Spirit, or spiritual food. That is because God gave it to them. They're sustained in their strength by God. He says, I'll read that one more time, verse 3, "And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they were all drinking from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ." The rock was Christ. Now, and I talk about this in the podcast, which seems very bizarre to me, is Paul is alluding to a Jewish interpretation of the time, that this rock that Moses used, when he beat the rock and water came out, he did it in 2 very different locations. So after decades of wandering in the wilderness, how is it he hits this rock with a name and it has water come out of it? And then at least one Jewish interpreter says it must be the case that this rock followed them through the wilderness as they wandered. And Paul assumes that. He says that, "For they all were drinking from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ." Now, in my view, and you don't have to have this view, my view is that Paul is not making a point about rocks following, though he does assume that here, and so forth. It seems to me the point he makes, and he goes on about their example for us, these things happen as examples for us, that we will not crave evil things as they did. It seems to me that Paul's point is that these people were sustained in the Spirit. Their strength, their faith were sustained by God. And in my interpretation, Paul's saying it's like that with you. That is, the way God the Father took care of our ancient Israelite ancestors, he took care of them. He helped them stay on the path and not veer off. That's how Christ is with us. That's how Christ is with us. So he's using that as an example. While that rock for them gave them nutrients, water, that rock for us is Christ. That's my interpretation of it. You don't have to have the same. So if you disagree with me and you think, no, that rock was the Messiah, well, you can have that view. I mean, you can. I don't think so. I don't think the Messiah ever became a rock. I don't think the Messiah ever became a tree or a rock or water or a mountain. I think the Messiah was and always is and has been a person, a living being. And so I don't think beings can be rocks. No more than I think beings can be doors when Jesus says he's the door, the gatekeeper. Remember in John, he's the good shepherd and all that. So, I mean, it's just a metaphor. I think Paul's making just a metaphor. That's why I think Paul even adds the word spiritual in front of the word rock. That is, Christ, it can't be a rock. Now, you might think, well, David, it's just a metaphor, but that was the Messiah who gave them that spiritual strength. My response is, maybe so. Maybe so. I just don't know. I'm not certain about it. It seems to me that Paul's point is not that, but maybe I'm wrong, and maybe you're right, that he was there all along giving them spiritual strength. Maybe so, absolutely. And if that's what Paul means, then this is a reference to Paul believing, the Apostle Paul believing, that the second member of the Trinity was active in the Old Testament. But notice, this has nothing to do with the angel of the Lord. This is not the Malach Yahweh. This is one reference to one particular thing, and this is not the Malach Yahweh. Thanks for listening so far. I'll be right back. It can be difficult as a Christian to know what to do with our money. And there are all kinds of good books out there to read, but I encourage you, if you want something short and sweet and to the point, check out my book, Give It Away, on Amazon.com. It's very cheap. Go there today to get Give It Away, and it's a wonderful study to use in small groups. It has discussion questions and reflection questions ready to go. It's a 4-week study on how the earliest Christians used money and their possessions. Hey, not everybody can be a biblical scholar or an apologist, and I understand that. Everyone understands it. So we have to use good resources to help us, save us a lot of time, and give us things to think about and maybe some data, a good starting point. If I might be so bold, I would encourage you to read my book, A Skeptic Challenges a Christian. A Skeptic Challenges a Christian, on Amazon.com. You can check it out today. It's not expensive. So far, praise God, the reviews have been great. You can use it for small group study, Bible studies, whatever you want. And I think it's going to help encourage you and equip you. Perhaps even a skeptic you know. Maybe you can purchase the book for them. It's in multiple formats. You can listen to the book, Kindle, paperback, whatever it might be. I think it'll bless you. It would help me a whole lot if you like these podcasts. Let people know about it. Just share the link. Just share the link. What would Jesus do? He would share the link. That's what I think. I think he would do that. Let people know about A Glimpse of the Kingdom today.
Would you like Dr. Pendergrass to come visit your church? He could speak and provide classes and training on multiple topics. Visit davidpendergrass.com for more information.
Okay, let's pick back up where I left off. Here's another example where it might be the second member of the Trinity, as it were, in the Old Testament. There's only two I can think of, and I just told you the first one, 1 Corinthians chapter 10. The other one is Jude, and then Jude only has one chapter. So in Jude verse 5, he says, "Now I desire to remind you, even though you have been fully informed of these facts once for all, that Jesus, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, later destroyed those who do not believe." Now that's just amazing. There's no reference like this in the entire Bible, and certainly, of course, not in the New Testament. There's no reference even close to this, that thinking that Jesus, and using the word Jesus, not the Son or the Lord or Messiah, but the personal name of Jesus. Well, in the textual apparatus, in the manuscripts, in the early manuscripts that scholars used to make up the Greek New Testament, by far the best attested word, that is the one that has the most amount of corroborating evidence, is Jesus. But you'll see translations that don't put Jesus, they put Lord. They put Lord, and that's pretty common. Well, I don't know if it's pretty common, but more modern translations are now putting Jesus because of the Nestle Aland, the Greek New Testament version. But you'll see like the NIV, which is very, very popular in at least North America. In North America, it's in the NIV, it says, "I want to remind you that the Lord at one time delivered his people out of Egypt." But again, you'll see that, but other translations will have Jesus. So I'm not sure what translation you use, but you'll see that. The committee working on the Nestle Aland 27th and 20th edition, which is the Greek edition, whence your English translation comes. In fact, where most translations of the Bible in the world come from, that Greek version of the New Testament. there's a committee of brilliant scholars on there. Bruce Metzger, who at the time was the chair of the committee, who's now dead, but is generally regarded as the finest textual critic of the last century. He actually dissented from the committee. He thought it should be Jesus, because if you're just being hardcore scientific with the principles of textual criticism, and I won't give you the details now because that's a different podcast on textual criticism. But he's right that if you just follow the principles of textual criticism that scholars lay out, then Jesus must be the one you put down. It must be the word you choose. But the committee at large said we just can't buy it. That there's no way that Jude originally said Jesus delivered people or brought people out of Egypt. There's just no way, because it never occurs anywhere in the New Testament. Jude himself doesn't speak that way, and they gave some other possible explanations for it. And so you get to decide. If you think Jesus is the proper explanation there, then that is a New Testament reference to Jesus being involved in something in the Old Testament. And of course, that would be the Exodus account coming out of Egypt. Even if that's the case, of course, it doesn't say just as the Malach Yahweh or Jesus. So at best, you would say, well, that's what they had in mind, if that's your argument. My own view is I agree with the committee. I don't think Jude had Jesus in mind. I think at some level early on in the manuscript copying process, it was changed to Jesus. That's my view. I think, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Jude said, no, I was trying to make sure everyone understood that Jesus saved and judged people back then, just like he saves and will judge people now. I'm fine with that theology. I'm not convinced that was the case. If you look at texts like Exodus 12:51, Exodus 12:51 says, "And on that very day, the Lord," that is Yahweh, "brought the Israelites out of the land of Egypt by their divisions." He brought the Israelites out of the land. You see things like that often in the Old Testament, that the Lord brought them out. Well, when you compare that verse with Jude, verse 5, that the Lord at one time delivered his people, or you might even say brought them out, there's just a quick, easy parallel, almost, or a very close parallel with Old Testament references. So the Lord probably is the best idea, unless Jude is trying to make sure that his ancient audience said, no, I want you to see this as Jesus himself, who both could rescue and judge, just like he'll do for the world at large. And maybe that's the case. Anyway, so the only two references I can think of in the entire New Testament that get the closest to believing that there was a pre-incarnate Christ in the Old Testament is the one in 1 Corinthians 10:4, and then here in Jude verse 5. And both of those do not allude to an angel of the Lord and replace it. They don't quote an Old Testament verse where it says, "And the angel of the Lord said or did," and replace that with Jesus or something like that. So, nevertheless, if you want to believe that, you can. It just seems to me that if you're going to make an argument that the early Christians believed that this Malach Yahweh was the pre-incarnate Christ, then the early Christians did a very bad job of making that point. A very bad job. I think if you ask the early Christians, was the pre-incarnate Christ always alive, as it were? I think they would say yes. If we asked them, and what was he doing in the New Testament, the best we get, it seems to me, the best evidence suggests that what they would have said, well, primarily he was involved in creation and maybe some other things, but some, maybe in that one reference in 1 Corinthians 10, and maybe here in Jude, they might say, and there were a couple instances where he was really involved in these massive events, like the children wandering through the Exodus, or maybe being rescued and judged. Maybe so. You have texts like in John 1, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was fully God. The Word was with God in the beginning. All things were created by Him. Apart from Him, not one thing came created that was being created." And we have these massively, these are very high views of Christ, and you don't have the exact same, it seems to me, high views of the angel of the Lord all the time. There are texts, though, that seem to suggest that he's at the same level, but I already told you my explanation of those things. You have in Colossians 1:15, he being Christ, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. And of course, everything was created by him. Here's another example of something that makes me not think that the Messiah or the second member of the Trinity is in the ancient world. You see these kind of things in the New Testament, like in Hebrews chapter 1. Hebrews chapter 1 verse 1 says, "After God spoke long ago in various portions and in various ways to our ancestors through the prophets, in these last days he has spoken to us in a Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he created the world." So we see, it seems there's a distinction between the way he used to speak versus now how he speaks today. So I end where I said already in the middle of the podcast, which is I'm not sure if that's the pre-incarnate Christ. I don't find it convincing. I'm kind of up in the air. I lean towards no. My view is that I lean towards, was the pre-incarnate Christ always around? Yes. Did ancient Jews think that? No way. Not a chance. Did the pre-incarnate Christ help with the Exodus? Maybe so. Is that in the Old Testament? No, it's not. Did the early Christians think that? Maybe Jude did. And maybe Paul did, maybe. Besides that, I don't know if any of the Christians thought that until the early church fathers who read Jesus into everything in the Old Testament, basically. And I don't find most of their interpretations pretty convincing because of several reasons. But that's my view on that. I hope this isn't too confusing for you, Jeff, but I wish I had more definitive. But again, I'm trying to be as fair as I can on that. One last issue. You said, so I discussed that. Is this a Christophany? For my listeners, a Christophany just means an appearance of Christ. So back to his question, a Christophany is all that means. And again, my answer is I'm not sure if it's a Christophany. It might be. I am not, theologically, I'm not against it. I care about exegesis. That is, what's the proper interpretation of the text, and that's where I'm not convinced. And this last thing he asked, was there a dual Godhead theology in the Old Testament? That's a great question, Jeff, and that's also a good long podcast. If you read modern Jewish interpreters, you'll get all kinds of different responses. If you read biblical scholars, both Jewish and Christian scholars, of what ancient Jews believed, you get something differently. You'll get a different response. And the reason why you get different responses typically is because modern Jews are reading the Old Testament through the lens of the Talmuds, and historians are not doing that. And that makes a massive difference on the conclusions you're going to draw when you interpret the Bible. And that's one reason why I don't prefer reading modern Jews when they read their Bible. It doesn't mean it's all wrong. Doesn't mean I can't learn anything, because I do learn some things. But in general, I just don't value the Talmuds as a proper interpretive lens or tool. So when you read when you read historians of the Old Testament, and that includes both Christian and Jew, it doesn't matter. When they study it, the answer is, it sure seems to be. The ancient Jews, people like Larry Hurtado has written on ancient Jewish monotheism, and you can read all kinds of books on this issue, or essays or letters and chapters and books on this issue. It's pretty common in New Testament studies because of this discussion of Jesus. When Jesus came on the scene, and the early Christians then, of course, wrote about him after his death and resurrection, did they make up something brand new by saying things like Christ was part of creation? Was that a brand new idea, or was that an old school Jewish idea? Those kinds of questions. Did it fit into ancient Judaism? And that's debated in New Testament scholarship. So it matters whether or not we can demonstrate that Jews thought of God as having various persons. And my own view is that, in general, there are strong indications that they did think that way, and it seems to me at least three major ways, and I'll say this quickly and move on, and I may be done with the podcast. I think that the absolute number one way they perceived of their God was, of course, who we would say is God the Father. Jews in the ancient world typically did not say God the Father. They could refer to God as Father, but it was not common. Christians say God the Father all the time because we were taught to say that by Jesus, and we had believed God the Son and so forth. So we add the appellation the Father because we're Christians, and that becomes again I'll just repeat it, that Jesus gave us. He told us that's a common. It becomes common for us. In the Old Testament, so I would say Yahweh. Okay, Yahweh or Elohim, the God the Father. That's the number one way they understand Jews, is that He's that. But they also do understand in God, they personify, secondly, God's spoken word, His wisdom. And we see this throughout the text, but particularly, of course, in the book of Proverbs, where wisdom becomes personified. And this becomes one trajectory in Jewish literature. We get to other books. There's a book of wisdom from which Paul draws to write portions of Romans and others. It was a popular Jewish book. So you will read Old Testament texts which speak of God's wisdom as personified, as part of creation, as part of doing things in the world. And of course, thirdly, you'll see God's Spirit as personified, not just a force, but he becomes a he, and he does things, and his Spirit makes decisions. Now, it's not as developed as the New Testament, but you'll see these there. And of course, you have, depending on your interpretation of the Malach Yahweh, you have this kind of being who speaks as if it's God's behalf. But those at least three major ways, it seems to me the three major ways, something like God the Father, Yahweh, God's wisdom, and then God's Spirit. The early church took that and said God's wisdom equals the pre-incarnate Christ. We see this, Gospel of John, his prologue. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos. And if you're a Greek or Roman or a Jew, you understand that as wisdom. Now, they have different understanding. If you're a Greek philosophically minded person, you're more influenced by the Stoics, who had a little different conception of the Logos. But the Jews had one as well. And through Philo and other ways, we can see what Jews believed about this word theology, this wisdom theology. The early church fathers thought Proverbs 8 was about Jesus when he says, before creation, I created you. That is his wisdom. And that became a big fighting point, whether or not Jesus was created, because they associated Jesus with wisdom. So, and that's a bunch of podcasts. But the point I'm going to make right now is these three major categories, if we'll call them categories, seem to me to exist. Now, a person might respond to that and say, David, these are not categories. These are just different ways of speaking about Yahweh. And they're trying to keep him distinct. So it's personifications, but where they don't really believe God's wisdom really took on a personhood. They don't really believe his Spirit was a he. It's just a nice way of talking about God. That's possible. I mean, that is possible. It's just that's not what the text says. They seem to really be personified, and that personification is there. And now, whether or not you say so, your question, was there a dual Godhead theology in the Old Testament? My response is yes, but not nearly as developed as we get to the New Testament. The arrival of Jesus on the scene really was a new thing, as some say, a new permutation in Jewish theology. It wasn't completely out of place, but the degree to which it was emphasized, its nuances, a lot of these things, they developed within Jewish Christianity in the first couple centuries in a way that had never been done before. So, in my opinion, the answer is yes, but you see a lot of new trajectories and permutations with the coming of Jesus that I think would not have come without Jesus. And my proof for that is, today ask a normal rabbinic Jew. They have similar ideas of what I just said now. Well, yeah, there's God the Father and His Word and His Spirit, but they have different views of that issue, of that particular issue. They would not at all have a Trinitarian view of God, at all. You need Jesus for that. You just do. You need a resurrection and ascension to develop those kinds of ideas. Seems to me. Thanks, brother. Hope you're doing well. God bless you. See you next time. Well, the conversation isn't finished. You can always reach out to me on social media. Are you on Facebook? I am too. At Glimpse of the Kingdom. Glimpse of the Kingdom on Facebook. Be sure to like it and you can see updates there. Also, if you're on Twitter, check me out at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass, or at Glimpse the King, at Glimpse the King, and I try my best to respond to comments and questions on there as quickly as I can. If you want more, there are many more resources on the podcast and my blog. Go to my website, davidpendergrass.com, and you can see a full list of the podcast, and my blog is available for free. Are you active in a church right now? I'd be happy to come out to your church and do all kinds of classes and workshops there. Check out davidpendergrass.com, davidpendergrass.com for more information. And may God in His great grace give you even just a glimpse of His kingdom this week. See you next time.